Emily Owens is the David and Michelle Ebersman Assistant Professor of History at Brown, where she does research on and teaches about U.S. slavery, the legal history of race and sexual violence, and the intellectual history of American feminisms. Her book, Consent in the Presence of Force, Sexual Violence and Black Women's Survival in Antebellum New Orleans, which we're here to discuss today, tells stories of enslaved women who were conscripted into brothels, concubinage, or the so-called fancy trade, to map the architecture of sexual violence in U.S. slavery. Her writing has also been published in Signs, the Journal of Women, Culture and Society, Differences, The Black Scholar, Literary Hub, and Louisiana History. I wanted to add to that formal bio that it is absolutely a pleasure and a privilege to be here to talk about Emily's fantastic and brilliant book. I've had the pleasure of co-teaching with her and learned so much from her and her research, and I am so excited for our discussion today.
Thank you, Juliet. And thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure. And yeah, it's like really a pleasure to get to talk about this book among friends and with friends. I want to thank Stephanie and Trey and Ellie and Maggie at the CSREA for putting together this event, for inviting me, and for putting together this series. It's been so wonderful to get to learn about the work of our colleagues in the last couple of sessions, and I feel really honored to be in such esteemed company this semester. And yeah, thank you, Juliet, for reading deeply and thinking with me now, but really over the last several years about this project and about these questions. So it's just a total joy to be in conversation with you, and thank you for doing this. So I thought that what I would do today, particularly because this is kind of an intimate space in a way, like we know each other, is that I didn't want to give like a kind of formal set of remarks. I thought instead that I would just map the book really briefly and then read to you a little bit of what I wrote. So that's what I'm going to do. So as Juliet said, I wrote this book about women who were conscripted into sexual labor as part of their enslavement in Antebellum New Orleans. And I think about Antebellum New Orleans as the core of the book, but really I'm trying to map a new geography to think about sex and slavery during the 18th and especially the 19th century. And New Orleans is a useful place, I think, to do that thinking because it sort of speaks in a southerly way. It speaks to a set of habits and customs and legal structures that existed in the Caribbean, particularly in Caribbean port cities around sex and slavery, which happened, in the 17th and 18th century, but really extended in the Caribbean and the South Atlantic into the 19th century. And Americanists tend to kind of like leave the story of the Atlantic world right around 1776 and pivot to the US. But I'm interested in kind of using New Orleans to think about a southerly set of geographies, cultural and legal geographies. But also I think New Orleans helps us think about the antebellum South and also the kind of imperial frontier of the expanding United States in the 19th century. And so I'm using this sort of place as a switch point through which to think about the lives of enslaved women kind of throughout what I'm calling the antebellum Atlantic. So this book is really trying to map the legal architecture of sexual violence. So I was really interested in this book in thinking and sort of staying with a question that historians of slavery have engaged with since the beginning of the field, which is about sort of how sexual violence becomes so central to the entire project of the Atlantic slave trade. And for many of us, that question has pointed toward reproduction, which is a really important part of the story of sexual violence against enslaved women. But I'm not that interested in reproduction in this project. I'm interested in the forms of sexual labor that enslaved women were conscripted into that were not about reproduction, in which reproduction was like maybe an incidental afterthought, but was not actually the cause. And I think that when we capture our imagination around sex and slavery exclusively around reproduction, we can lose the kind of like nonsensical, kind of excessive modes of violence that existed in the context of US slavery that were not entirely captured by the logics of capitalism. So I think there's a way that thinking sex in the history of capitalism leads us into reproduction because that is a kind of logical endpoint for slaveholders. And what I'm interested in is all of the sexual violence that happened in ways that were not logical, did not actually lead to any kind of direct capital accumulation. And so that's sort of the entry point into this book for me. Like, that's the landscape that I'm interested in mapping. And I wanted to understand what the legal architecture was that made that possible and really underwrote the set of economic, but especially cultural customs that made the sexual violation of enslaved women one of the core sort of aspects of slavery's culture. I want to understand how violence becomes ordinary. One of the things that I was really interested in writing this book, and that I remain really interested in, are forms of violence or things that are harmful to people that are totally legal. And in the case of US slavery, sexual violence against enslaved women was totally legal, and there was quite a specific sort of set of legal modes that made that happen. So I'm really interested in this book in trying to understand what it takes for slaveholders and the lawmakers who aided and abetted them to make, not just erase or cover over, but to make normal, to make ordinary violence against enslaved people generally and sexual violence against enslaved women specifically, but also what it means to then endure violence when the world around you doesn't experience it as violence. So does it change one's experience of violence? But also, what I've seen is that it certainly changes the way that someone would go about contesting that violence or trying to seek redress or trying to get out of it. So the heart of the project for me has really been thinking about transactions. I am interested in thinking about enslaved women who are kind of living at the intersection of sexual violence and sexual commerce. So they were enslaved in commercial sex. They were working in brothels, they were concubines, they were in long-term and short-term sexual arrangements with white men, and their slavery was defined by sex. And so I look at them in a way because I think that the question of consent, which is the legal category through which sex is regulated, is also the space that in which sexual commerce and commerce of all kinds is kind of regulated but also enacted. Like, transaction is the ideological home of the consenting subject, of the willful subject. Mm-hmm. And that's really complicated for enslaved people who are excluded from the capacity to consent legally. They're excluded from the capacity to be understood as subjects who have or can withhold will. And so these women who are living as enslaved concubines are simultaneously excluded legally from the capacity to express any kind of sexual will or any kind of will. Their legal personality excludes them from the capacity to be understood as people who can consent. And they are in these transactions all the time, which is accumulating a set of habits, a set of rituals that seems to build a kind of consenting subject in terms of the habits and performances that the consenting subject is supposed to be doing in the eyes of American law. So that contradiction is really interesting to me. And what I've found in this book is that moment of transaction, that moment of consent, is not the moment that frees the subject, that makes sex good, that makes sex free, that makes sex possible, that makes love and desire possible, but instead that consent, which is to say sexual transactions or sex that is understood as a transaction, actually ensnares women in a set of ideologies that imagine that the harm that is done to them is something that they are participating in, that they're culpable for, that they're party to the contract, and so their hands are unclean. I build out that legal argument in the book, but I'm not going to take you there right now. I just want to give you a taste of what the book sounds like now, and tell you the story of Delphine, or part of it. So Delphine is the person who occupies the first chapter of my book, and she was a girl who was born in Haiti. She was born free, and she ended up enslaved in New Orleans. And I know about her because she sued for her freedom when she was in her 30s, after she'd been enslaved for 20 years. And her story, I think, helps us understand both the massive forms of catastrophe and violence at scale that informed the lives of enslaved women and the ways in which violence was totally baked into their experience, but also the kind of quotidian, individual, interpersonal forms of violence, catastrophe, and loss that made her so vulnerable to the system that she was living in. and that was out to get her. And in this story, one of the main modes through which her vulnerability is produced are transactions between enslaved women or formerly enslaved women or women who are adjacent to slavery and white men who have a lot of power. So I'm just going to read to you a little bit. This is a little new for me, but I'm going to try it. Delphine boarded the ship in the care of her grand aunt, Marie Therese. She was still just a girl, and this foster mother of sorts had said it was time to go. Their hometown, known as Le Cap, was burning. Delphine left with her Aunt Florence and cousin Légère, and their shared caretaker, Marie Therese, as well as Monsieur Belgence, the white apothecary with whom Marie Therese kept company. It was 1803, and they set off across the sea. It is probable that Delphine didn't know much about where she was headed. At only 5 years old, she likely went where she was told. Perhaps she requested to stay behind in the life she had known in Saint-Domingue. Perhaps she asked if she could remain in the care of her Aunt Luce, who stayed on the island when the rest of the family fled. But her city was caving under the weight of war. And as people who spoke French, had light skin, and had a family history of slaveholding as well as of enslavement, they would not evade suspicion from either Leclerc's and Rochambeau's terror campaigns or from Dessalines' era of executions. Whether or not they sympathized with a vision of a free Haiti, their bodies and their lineage betrayed the possibility of alignment with the French. And so they took flight. And so it was that catastrophe and rupture came to define the ordinary rhythm of Delphine's life. The rhythm of catastrophe began long before Delphine was born. At a seismic scale, Delphine was born almost a decade into the protracted, violent, and politically complicated era of the Haitian Revolution, which upended life on the island while also rocking the balance of power and scope of political and economic possibility in the entire Atlantic world. At a much smaller scale, Delphine was born into the racially and legally complex context of her family, wherein one sister owned another. Marie Therese, a free woman of color living in the island's most active port city, owned her own sister, Marie Catherine. How did such an arrangement come to be? It is possible that they were both born enslaved and one managed to get free before the other. But in the telling of their neighbors and acquaintances, Marie Therese was born free. So perhaps she was the younger of the two sisters, both birthed by the same mother who had herself gained freedom over the course of a single lifetime. Had their mother been a ménagère in the tradition of some Saint-Domingue households, she would have been responsible for managing the house, cooking and cleaning and overseeing the domestic work of other enslaved people, as well as providing sexual congress and romantic gestures to the man who owned her. Such scenarios of intimate, domestic, and affective work were familiar among women of urban Saint-Domingue, as elsewhere on the island and across the Caribbean, and were structured by kinds of exchange wherein faithful service might entitle her to emancipation upon the whim or the death of the man who owned her. Of course, there were many scenarios in which that possibility could evaporate if the man took a white wife who refused to maintain his parallel extramarital household, or if his estate fell into arrears, making the ménagère more valuable to him as movable property than as the person with whom he shared a bed. He could reify his promises in writing, in his will, but his heirs might deny the sanity of those promises and confirm the enslaved status of the woman, her children, and any other problematic persons in property that remained on the estate by selling them off. These scenarios were also dependent on the law and whether the emancipator had properly followed procedure, including passing the act before a notary public and getting the act ratified before the colonial governor. Without those in hand, and the law says, quote, the persons were considered only as statutae libres, which is the embodied form of promised but not yet achieved freedom. So that is to say, if the enslaved ménagère was imagined as an icon of the luscious excesses and erotic privileges of Caribbean slaveholding, her story is also one of constant bodily surveillance in close quarters and of the constant threat of legal and bodily endangerment. Indeed, the concomitance of sexual pleasure for slaveholders and existential threat for the women they bedded was utterly compatible with the machinations of Atlantic slavery through till its bitter end. Thus, although freedom shaped the ménagere's horizon of possibility, it was also the hinge that justified the sexual character of her ongoing enslavement. Nevertheless, the sisters Marie-Therese and Marie-Catherine, perhaps sharing their mother's name, arrive in the record as born free and born enslaved, respectively, suggesting a change in their mother's legal status between the time of their births. If their mother had been the ménagère of a white man's household, their births were likely the result of sexual contact between her and the owner. He might have promised to free her upon his death or upon some other juncture, meaning that when she gave birth to the first child, she was still enslaved, thus bearing an enslaved child. But when she gave birth to the second, she was already free, thus bearing a free child. The particulars of the situation are at once impossible to determine and beside the point. That acquaintances never bothered to explain their differently status sisterhood points to the ordinariness of the scenario. To be of different legal status than one's sister in urban Saint-Domingue at the end of the 18th century was unremarkable. So Marie-Therese has ownership over Marie-Catherine, and then Marie-Catherine has a set of daughters, including one named Caroline, and Marie-Therese starts to free her family members. Then the newly freed Caroline, daughter of Marie-Catherine and niece of Marie-Therese, and there's a family tree in the book that some wonderful librarians at the Rock helped me make, because this is really confusing. So if you're confused, that's okay. Delphine is the main thing. Main person you want to pay attention to. But anyway, the newly freed Caroline, daughter of Marie-Catherine and niece of Marie-Therese, gave birth to a baby girl, Delphine, born in flames sometime around 1798. The revolution was raging. The original leader of the rebel forces, Toussaint Louverture, had been joined by André Rigaud, and together they worked to push the opportunistic imperial forces of Britain and Spain off the island. They had split their power by territory, with Rigaud controlling the south and Louverture controlling the north, where Delphine and her family lived. Their alliance was a tense one, always under threat from the needling influence of the unstable political structure imposed by the French, who were desperate to maintain the island as the jewel of France's imperial crown. Tense peace erupted into civil war. The Civil War, known as the War of Knives, because of its brutality and close combat, broke out while Delphine was a toddler, expanding her newly learned capacity to walk into running, jumping, skipping, and dancing. In 1801, Louverture declared a new constitution that abolished slavery, but Delphine's family, already free, were in a strange spot. As a band of freed slaves and free people of color, populations French colonists had courted from the beginning, their fortunes on the island were uncertain. After Napoleon's forces showed up, the most violent period of the revolution unfolded as French desperation to hold onto the island devolved into total war. Even if Dessalines proclaimed the unity of, quote, the blacks and the coloreds as one family, the vulnerability of civilians amid the chaos was unmistakable. It was time to go. Even as their surrounds were in chaos and their political future was uncertain, Delphine's family dealt with tragedy on an intimate scale. Caroline, Delphine's mother, was dead. Her grandmother, Marie-Catherine, dead as well. And so, as the world burned around her, Delphine's intimate universe also collapsed. The little girl was informally adopted by Marie-Therese, the woman who was at once the former owner of her closest kin and her grand aunt. It was thus that Delphine became a refugee in her first decade of life under the care of a relative who had once also owned her mother and grandmother. They had no papers with them when they left the island, for Delphine's maternal family had been enfranchised just before the burning of Le Cap in 1793, when, quote, 3/4 of the city was burned and a great many of the offices of the notary public offices were burnt. All that paper, gone. Upon her arrival in the legal and political maelstrom that was 1804 in New Orleans, so she's kind of hopscotched across the Caribbean at this point, the chaos that characterized Delphine's young life took a darker turn. She arrived in an unknown city, now officially under the care of a white man who had had a companionate relationship with her grand aunt. The grand aunt died. Whether Bellejeans knew the circumstances of Delphine's complex family tree is unknown, But the power dynamics that structured their legal family before her birth nonetheless resurfaced in this transition. Those dynamics were predictive. If Marie-Therese had formerly owned Delphine's grandmother and mother, and if slave status was passed through the maternal line, then Delphine's freedom was always already haunted by slavery. Delphine was born free, but her proximity to slavery was so close. No one disputed that her mother had once been enslaved, or her mother before her. Thus, Delphine's freedom was fragile, more like a subjunctive state of slavery. She was always someone who could be enslaved, or could be understood as a slave because of her family history. The slippage was so easy and so simple. Was her mother really free? And how would one ever know, given that the place where her free papers were copied was destroyed in the war? Years later, in the court case that brought her to my attention, she would exclaim it was shocking. Quote, "Shocking as it is to state that her status was converted to that of a slave, and that she was subsequently sold when she arrived in New Orleans." But her exclamation pretends not to know how very predictable the situation was. Delphine was a vulnerable girl with ties to slavery, whose life chances were tethered to a white man who could instrumentalize her body to secure his own financial ambitions and social stature in a new city. Her attachment to him, like that of her grand aunt, could have potentially shielded her from the grip of slaveholding society, gasping for air in a sea of revolutionary conflict. He could hold the papers that described her free status, and he could speak to the other white men who controlled the ports, the auctions, the real estate, and the law as they hopscotched across the Gulf. He could do this, or he could decide not to. She could remain tied to him, which might be a blessing, but it might just as easily be a curse. He could be protector, or he could be predator. And either way, he would remain a determining force in the little girl's life chances. So I'll stop there. Delphine's life proceeds after she's sold in New Orleans. She's sold a couple of times and sort of trained up as a fancy maid, so as a domestic and sexual laborer in the city. She's sold to a guy named Devez, who is a doctor. He's a fancy doctor, and he keeps a bunch of houses, each of which has a couple of concubines in it. So he kind of has like a harem over the course of the city. And eventually she flees and she tries to sue for her freedom and she wins. And in a way, that's like this really triumphant story with which to begin the book. She wins. But at the same time, she started out free. And so the kind of fragility of the freedom that she achieves is always kind of a specter that haunts the rest of the story. And throughout the rest of the book, we see women who are living on either side of the border of legal freedom, but always their capacity to enact that freedom is tied to a set of transactions that they are enduring with people who have actual power in that society. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. And thank you, Juliet, for reading.
So thank you for that. I think the way that we agreed that this would go is I would pose a couple of questions and then we will open things up for your questions. So I wanted to start by talking about these women. And, you say that they are difficult to write about, in part because they trouble the dominant narratives and expectations in the scholarship on slavery. Yeah. And at one point you say that you call them women who I contingently and cautiously call the women who said yes. Mm. And I remember the first time that I heard you talk about this project. And it's not what we think of in terms of when we think about the stories that we tell about slavery, that we want to tell about slavery, right? So it's not what we think resistance looks like. And it's not, and as you pointed out in the case of Delphine, right, these are not also easy narratives of movement from slavery to freedom. Yeah. Right? It's not the heroic escape and, and suddenly, right, you go from this very clear enslaved status to the supposedly clear free status. Yeah. They're also, interestingly, even though some of them have children, they're also not these tales of women's heroic enslaved maternity. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And of course, they're performing sexual labor, most of them. So I wondered if you could talk about what it means or what it meant to try to write about them, and how people have received the project, given that it troubles so many of the narratives that have been so foundational to the way in which we now write and think about slavery.
Yeah, thank you. That feels like the core of the project. So thank you for that question. I think that I am very cautious, and I have learned to be very cautious in framing my approach to these women. And at some point in the writing, that phrase, the women who said yes, was like much bigger in the book. And it's now just a little, it kind of like slips by in a chapter. But it's really important. So you caught this really important thing. Because I think that I am interested in women who were, I say that these women are difficult to write about, and they're difficult to write about, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that the narrative frame, and I think it's a moral frame of slavery studies, has been very focused for a long time on a linear narrative from slavery to freedom. And whether that is a narrative from slavery to freedom that tracks actual people's lives, or just imagines a set of horizons of possibility that enslaved people were preoccupied with, that has been a primary organizing principle for slavery studies since the inception of the field. And I think that that is a really important horizon of possibility and sort of set of frames, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, in which everybody's talking about freedom. So it's not like enslaved people were not preoccupied with a liberal sense of freedom. We're not thinking about the state as a potential agent of redress or of exercising, like gaining some material security. But I also think it's limiting, because I think there were a lot of other things that enslaved people were up to. And I think that the kind of totalizing landscape of domination that enslaved women were located within meant that I think, and what I've seen, is that their sense of the organizing principles and frames of a life were not actually structured by a kind of liberal humanist idea of there's enslavement and there's freedom, or there's capture and there's liberation. Like, I think that I have come to understand them as operating on a totally different plane. And so they're not easy heroes. If heroics requires a kind of like collective effort for joint liberation, for like a kind of sense of themselves as part of a people, like a kind of like nationalist racial project that I think is also very much rooted in or like enmeshed in slavery studies in an African American studies context. Like, that project, I think, is rooted through our readings of slavery, looking for solidarity, looking for our sense of a people, of a racial project, and wanting to read for a particular form of resistance in the past that I think would be mobilizing, or that we imagine will be mobilizing for contemporary politics, whenever that contemporary is. And I think that the women that I write about are sometimes out for themselves, sometimes making arguments in court that will actually make it harder for other women to get out, that will reify the kind of racial logic. The women that I write about, maybe most of the time, looked white. And they were enslaved, and I think that really matters. And it's not like I'm trying to add them to the narrative and say, like, they matter too. That's not really the point. But to start with a set of characters who have hovered around the edges of the story of slavery in the United States. In slave narratives, they appear as these like tragic figures of, like, Solomon Northup will write about the concubine who sold down the river, and that, like, she works as a kind of operative trope of, like, there's something really shady happening in slavery, and I'm not even really gonna name it, but I'm gonna let all of you know. Or, like, abolitionists are really focused on white slaves. Like, that's a huge part of abolitionist literature and photography, particularly at the end of the antebellum period, as, like, there is something really perverse happening here. Like, there is racial chaos in the South, everybody. Like, let's freak out about it, And so everybody knows these people are here, and I think to in the present and in contemporary, slavery studies, but also feminist and Black feminist spaces, the specter of the mistress is always around and really bothersome. She needles us because she doesn't fit super neatly into this trajectory of refusal or of a version of resistance that, even if it's not armed resistance, is a kind of like internal refusal of the project of slaveholders. And I don't think that the women that I am writing about sort of capitulated and accepted and were psyched about slaveholding. No way. That's not at all what I'm trying to suggest. But I am trying to suggest that they were operating on a different plane in terms of their sense of their temporal horizon. Like, I don't think that they were, most of the women who were enslaved in the Atlantic world were born and died in slavery. And that's true of most of the women in my book too. And so that sense of freedom is this inevitable thing that's going to happen at the teleological end of the story. I don't actually think that's necessarily historically represented in the way that they argued their court cases or the way that they, protected their children. Like, they weren't necessarily thinking that it was going to end. So then what do? You might make different set of choices, right? And I think similarly, the narratives of women who were enslaved in sexual service tend to get pigeonholed into this either or of basically there's a big part of the book is really thinking about the language of rape law, and consent. But like the narrative in African American women's history and in slavery studies broadly is, that women like Sally Hemings who were all like returning to the well to keep thinking about why. Like, there's something there that we want to know. We want to know, like, was she raped or did she love him? And I think that those polls are both pretty irrelevant, actually. And the women in this book demonstrate like just a whole other range of problems and possibilities that they're encountering on a day-to-day level. And for me also, like, the draw to write about them is not just to solve a problem in slavery studies, although that's a nice kind of bonus. If it's been solved, maybe that's a little self-aggrandizing, but that's not just about like trying to like look at the historiography and say like, we've missed these women. I also think the longer I worked on this and the more time I spent with these women, the more attuned I became to the ways that violence and sexual violence and intimate violence tends in general to be enduring and not spectacular or singular. And the kinds of, and so actually I think that the ways that they were navigating their worlds is incredibly instructive to understanding slavery and enslavement of all kinds of people, but also to the mismatch between the way that redress is activated in a kind of liberal democratic process and the ways that violence actually happens. So they're difficult to write about if what we want is liberal heroes. But I think like starting from a place where that's not the goal has opened up, I think, some interesting space.
That's really fascinating, and it makes me think also about our difficulty now, right? Thinking about women who suffer from domestic violence and the ways in which they also often trouble our expectations of what agency should look like. Yep. So I wanted to move for a minute to thinking about these connections to the present because, there is as a political theorist, of course, your critique of consent and the language of contract stands out to me. Yeah. And I think it's a pretty devastating case that you make here, that our conceptions of, autonomy and agency as they're, revealed in the way in which we think about consent are pretty much not useful for trying to think about violence and sexual violence in particular, even about sexuality in the context of patriarchy, which means it's in the context of of violence.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking here about there's of course we're familiar with Marxist critiques of the idea of contract and consent in the context of labor, but I feel like we're much less willing to admit the same in the case of sexuality, even today, right? Like even thinking about, women who marry, like, one of the things that is really interesting, I'm thinking about the case of, is it Anna Maria?
Yeah, Anna Maria.
Barclay, right? The one who says that she functioned as a wife
Yeah.
to this white man who had freed her. She comes back to him, lives for 2 decades as his mistress.
Yep.
And she is a very difficult case.
Yeah.
And I think, in that chapter, you opened by talking about Sally Hemings, and it makes me think about, this question of why, of the ways in which I think part of the very powerful argument you're making is that, focusing on these women forces us to think about that this clear dichotomy between, violent rape and then the sort of consensual sex that happens in supposedly, right, not, relationships like marriage is actually, just simply doesn't make sense for thinking about sexuality under patriarchy. And I think we still have a really hard time thinking about that. And I think about, even, today when we think about women who marry, let's say, quote unquote, for money or position, and the way in which we think about gold diggers, right? Or the way in which this whole, these categories that trouble this focus that we want to have, this line that we want to draw, and to which consent is so central. So I guess I wanted to ask you, why, and one of the really fascinating parts of the book too is the men who are pursuing what you call this fantasy of consent from these women, right? So not only do they have total access to them, but they want this thing from them. And so it made me think about how we also have this fantasy of consent that we're extremely attached to.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can say more about, why it's so difficult for us to think about, and how that hampers things like the way in which we think about crimes like rape, or even, violence that's not, sort of extreme, spectacular physical violence.
Yeah, I mean, that's really at the core, I think, of the critique. And it's one that I want to frame really cautiously, and try to frame cautiously in the book, because, and I say this in the book, the most durable way to undercut a woman's claim that she has experienced sexual violence is to say she wanted it, right? So and I think actually that is a problem that emerges from consent, as opposed to is butting up against the logic of rape and consent. I think it's actually baked into that logic. But I am basically asking, or one of the questions that I want to make possible is, well, what if she did? I think but of course that's an incredibly politically dangerous place to wander into. And so, that's also part of why I study the past and not the present. But I do think that the fantasy around consent is this that I think is present in the past and continues into the present, is this idea that if consent exists, if it has been articulated, if someone has a claim that they have expressed their will, then suddenly power dynamics go away, which is to say, you're free because you say you are. And I think that the invitation that I think these stories, these women's lives have given to me is to begin to ask not just how do we think about the range of violences, because I think there are an enormous range of violences that are not captured by a frame of in the presence of force and against her will, right? There's all kind of violence that is not captured by that. So I want to expand our vision of where violence lives, but also expand our vision
where intimacy lives, of where transactions live, of where like interpersonal affective ties live, because I think those places actually overlap profoundly. And I don't write about the emotional lives of the women that I studied because I don't know anything about them. And so I'm not trying to project some sense of like whether or not they desired the men that they were having sex with, because I don't care actually. And I don't think it really matters. But I do think that in the longue durée of thinking about sex and violence, we have this mode, and I'm extremely sympathetic to where it comes from. I think there's like a kind of second wave feminist desire to name and demarcate the kind of sex that is violent, right? And to make it really uncomplicated, because the response has always been, in US context, like, well, there's so many questions here, how could we understand, you know? And thus, how could we possibly begin to name harm? And so I think that second wave feminists were like, let's be really clear. No means no, right? And that was really important and really useful. But I also think that continuing to adhere to that, you know, the contemporary version is yes means yes. It's like, well, really, what does yes mean? And under what circumstances is yes clear? And I think that I'm kind of a little bit of a spoil sport when it comes to sex, because, you know, I sound a lot like Kat McKinnon in some ways, and like that's a drag, you know? And I don't actually share her politics around either sex or pornography or sex work. And yet I am extremely convinced by her sense of, by hers and Kimberly Crenshaw's and lots of feminists across various kinds of feminist debates, who see domination as a constant and a really important factor in understanding and illuminating what's happening in between two people, and also in wanting to direct our attention, our juridical attention, our political attention to structure, as opposed to interpersonal context. So to go back to where you started with the domestic violence stuff, like I think that I have become much more interested in intimate partner and domestic violence sort of toward the end of writing this book. Inspired by women like Anne Maria Barclay, who lived in these enduring situations. Like, you know, the question that I was asking when I first encountered her case, so she's this woman who's purchased at like 15 by a slave trader. He frees her shortly thereafter. She's in Ohio, she's got free papers, and then she goes back to New Orleans, and she goes back to the house and the bed of the guy who, you know, who owned her. And she lives there, and they have children, and she lives there for 30 years, and then he dies, and then there's a whole court drama that comes afterward, which is why I know about her. My question when I read that case was, why did she go back? And Tony Bogues actually was the one who was like, hello, she knows the street names. She has people. She understands the context. She doesn't know anybody in Ohio. Like, what's she gonna do in Ohio? So that was so helpful that Tony said that, but it opened up this whole landscape for understanding her life and beginning to ask a different set of questions about her sort of like political motivations, about her moral frame that she was operating in. But also, the question I asked of Anne Maria Barclay is the question that we ask survivors all the time, and it is the wrong question. Because Anne Maria Barclay was thinking about her immediate survival. She wasn't thinking about the Black freedom struggle. She was thinking about, like, where am I gonna get a meal tonight, right? And so there are myriad reasons that make a ton of sense why people, some of them emotional and affective and loving and intimate and about kin, some of them entirely pragmatic, that suture people in relationships in which harm is happening. And I think that this binary structure of like, it was rape or it wasn't rape, makes it just really, like, actually like completely confuses the scene. And just to answer the political science piece, the political theory piece, one thing that's become really interesting to me is theorizations of consent and also rights discourse generally that are turning to subjects, individuals, and modes of being that are not 18th century white guys. So 18th century white guys are like thinking of themselves as individuals, and I think actually they're completely delusional about that, but that's what they're saying, and that's where this whole discourse sort of emerges. But I think there are two people whose work I've been really influenced by. One is Samantha Pinto, who is trying to think about
trying to think about rights from the lives of Black women and from a sort of like Black feminist embrace of vulnerability, in which consent or the individual are not totally off the table, but you reimagine them as about a kind of modes of interconnection. That like consent doesn't make you an individual, but it just is part of a conversation, kind of thinking about leading with vulnerability as a kind of way of framing a rights discourse, as opposed to leading with like the self-contained individual, the autonomous person who's like fending for himself against others, you know, like she's sort of rethinking that. So I find that really instructive. And the other person whose work I'm really intrigued by is Tay Meadow, who is thinking about, who's a sociologist, who's doing ethnographic work in BDSM communities right now, and thinking about consent not as a moment, but as a process and a practice of care, which I think is really interesting. So it's not a declaration, it's not like a performative utterance that makes something, but instead is a set of habits and essentially like a set of recursive check-ins, and also an expectation that harm can also happen there in that space, and that repair is also inevitably part of the process. So not a process of like, you said yes and thus anything is possible, but you said yes and then what happened? And then what do we do with it? This kind of like recursive processual orientation to consent, which is, you know, really, it's kind of like looking at practice and trying to theorize from there. So I find both of those kind of like a little bit hopeful for that word, which, you know, I think in the tradition that I've, you know, been thinking about it, which is an American legal tradition. It's not a very hopeful place when you're thinking about sexual violence. So like I'm pretty down on it there, but I do think that there are modes of thinking in feminist space that are pretty exciting.
That's really, really generative to think with. And I'm going to, my last question, and then I'll open it up to yours, but since I have her, I'm going to pose one last one. And it was, one of the things that I really appreciate about the book is the care you take with their stories. And it made me think about, you know, the structure. Because the structure is that each chapter is about one woman's story. And that allows you to kind of, you know, both place what's happening to them, the choices they're making within the broader historical intellectual context, but also to position them as, you know, producers of ideas, right? As people who are doing a kind of important intellectual work. But as I'm appreciating that, I'm also picturing, right, young Emily in the archives, sort of this mountain of paper and all these cases, and thinking, wondering, you know, how did you end up here from what must have been like this daunting, you know, reams of cases, and how did you choose these? Like, what was the process of what ends up being this beautiful and, you know, very, you know, carefully crafted set of stories? How did that happen?
Thank you for saying all that. That's really nice. It did start out with like a lot of spreadsheets of like just trying to organize cases. I think I also at the beginning didn't know I was writing about violence. At the beginning of this, like as a graduate student, I thought that I was writing about exchange and like what happens in sexual exchanges. And so I was sifting through the archives of the Louisiana State Supreme Court, which are digitized. So that also, I mean, not entirely, but a lot of it. So that also was less reams of paper and more like tabs. But anyway, I was looking for cases that signaled some kind of sexual exchange or some kind of situation that looked or felt like sex slavery. So I was reading inheritance cases, I was reading divorce and adultery cases, I was reading, honestly, like a lot of inheritance cases, and then freedom suits. Because lots of people who pursued freedom through the courts in Louisiana were somehow involved in were somehow related to some kind of sexual contact between a slaveholder and an enslaved woman. And this wasn't always like a direct thing, but that was a good way in to try to find some people who I wanted to write about. And over the course of sifting cases, the other thing is that I initially thought that I was looking for distinct categories of sexual labor. And that I was like trying to aggregate a set of cases that could prove that the fancy trade happened, that could prove that concubinage happened, that could prove that enslaved women worked in brothels. Because that's also always been this like open question in slavery studies, is like, what is the fancy trade anyway? Like, did it really, sure, it really happened, but like, how do we evidence it? Like, there's a lot of subterfuge in the documentation. Like, women were not listed as fancy maids on slave rolls. They were listed as housekeepers. So like, how do you prove that, you know? So I was like I was out to kind of prove like this happened, this was a whole underground economy. So that was kind of how it started. And I think that the representativeness thing became much less interesting to me, or like the proving that this thing happened, aggregating enough cases. And it was so obvious to me that it was happening, and it became clear to me that for other historians it was also obvious. It just like, I don't know, like that it didn't need proving. So then I could actually think about, well, what's happening in here, and what might I learn if I went to this place? So that was a lot of how I sifted. And I think also like, I don't want to discount instinct. Like, I think there were cases that I wanted to read that I found interesting. And there were cases that I found really interesting but couldn't deal with as a graduate student, that were too hard. Like Delphine's case, was not in my dissertation. It was too hard. I didn't want to grapple with that. I don't think I had the tools. I just was too overwhelmed. And I came back to it, you know, much later. So I think some part of it was also just feeling like, wow, this is so weird. Like, what an interesting story. I want to know more. And then I would tumble into something in the case that I didn't understand. Like, oh, this is a statute that they're referencing. What does that statute mean? Like, there's one woman who works in a brothel, and she was one of the first cases that I found and wrote about. And she's arguing for her freedom based on a contract in which she's supposed to be freed after 7 years of labor in a brothel. And I was like, under what standing is it possible for an enslaved person to say, I'm legally entitled to my freedom after 7 years? What is that? So then it required a sort of investigation of the structure, because the structure was really less familiar than I thought it was going to be. I think we talk about the legal landscape of, and a lot of historians actually are really starting to, like, there's a lot of books that have come out in the last, I don't know, certainly since I was a graduate student, that are really thinking about Black litigants, are thinking about the ways that Black people pursued the courts, free and enslaved, across jurisdictions, not just in Louisiana. Like, there's a lot more work on that now than there was when I was a grad student. But I think that there was, I think we have this sense sometimes that the law is this place that was completely foreclosed to enslaved people, and that it was just like entirely disciplinary in a very straightforward way. And, you know, I always say this to my students, like, if it was simple, we would have figured it out already. Like, white supremacy is not simple. And so it was really interesting to kind of to be led into the nitty gritty of how these lawmakers were creating traps for enslaved people by following the women who were seeing the trap, naming the trap, going to court and being like, I'm getting myself out of this trap. So then I had to go understand the trap, you know? So that was kind of the process of building an architecture around a single woman's life.